Hello and welcome back to Metal Theory, the YouTube series where we learn and analyze music theory through heavy and alternative music. This episode I wanted to look at how Easycore bands like A Day to Remember, Chunk No Captain Chunk, and 4 Year Strong modulate between the major scale and its parallel minor to create hard-hitting songs that have a playful edge. If you aren't brushed up on your scales, here's a very basic intro. The easiest scale to learn first is the major scale. A scale is just a collection of notes, anywhere from 5 to 12 notes to be exact. Most commonly, scales contain 7 unique notes. To build a major scale, you can use this pattern. The W stands for a whole step, which is when you move by 2 notes. The H stands for a half step, which is when you only move by 1 note. Starting from any root note of your choosing, ascend notes using the major scale pattern. Let's say we want G to be our root. Now we move up a whole step, which is 2 notes. So our second note in our 7-note scale is A. If you follow the rest of the pattern, whole, half, whole, half, you end up with G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, and G again. The G major scale. Notice there are 8 notes. This is because your final half step should take you back to your root. This is a repeat note, an octave higher. Thus it is still a 7-note scale because there are only 7 unique notes. Each one of these notes gets assigned a number as well. Here's the major scale represented in numbers. These numbers are called scale degrees and help us refer to notes in the scale. So if I said, what's the 3rd scale degree of C major, you could start on C, use the major scale pattern to find out your C major scale is C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and clearly see your 3rd scale degree is E, because that is the 3rd note. The subgenre we're looking at today is kind of an oddball in heavy music, because it predominantly uses the major scale, which is strange, because major is generally happy and upbeat sounding. Not necessarily the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of metal. Let's see if you can hear the difference between the typical metal sound and Easycore. I'm gonna play you one more, and I want you to guess if the song is using the major scale or not. If you guessed major, then you are correct. Now that your ears can hear the difference, I want to show you a cool little trick these bands use to keep the music chunky. This requires a little more information to understand first. Going back to our major scale, I told you guys every note gets a number called a scale degree. Well, we can raise and lower these scale degrees to create different scales. Raising a scale degree means that the note it's attached to must move up 1 half step. And lowering the scale degree means the note must move down 1 half step. Now I'm going to show you the scale degrees for the most popular metal scale, the natural minor scale. As you can see, the 3rd, 6th, and 7th scale degrees have been lowered. Let's compare C major versus C natural minor. Again, you see the 3rd, 6th, and 7th notes have been lowered. A lot of metal also uses the Phrygian mode, which is basically the same scale degrees as natural minor, except the 2nd degree is also lowered. Quick side note, modes are essentially the same thing as scales. There's a few technical differences that aren't relevant to this lesson. Another piece of the puzzle is knowing that scales with the same root note are connected. If we have an F major scale, the F minor scale is called its parallel minor. Anytime you change scales, keys, or tonal centers in a song, this is called modulation. The big trick is switching between these 2 scales without making it sound too distracting, so that you can have these fun upbeat sections you can jump around to and moments that make Kyle want to punch through the drywall in his bedroom in the same song. Let's figure out how these bands are pulling it off. So here in our first modulation example, the first 4 measures are using a major scale. It's a pretty straightforward mix of power chords and scale tones. But then the next 2 measures are filled with this harsh tritone, which is not in key or a part of the scale. This tritone is being used to pivot us into a different scale. This works because no matter which key or scale you're using, tritones sound uneasy and restless. Regardless of where you put it, it will disorient your listener. From this state of shock, you can then transition your listener into a scale as long as the notes of your tritone are being used. See if you can hear what I'm talking about.
Something in my
Now that's a pretty simple technique, but clearly it's quite effective. Before we move on to the next one, let's see how they modulate back into the major scale. So in the first two measures here, we've still got this breakdown going. Then in the next two measures, we keep the same rhythm, but we replace the tritone with our old root note, and we replace the chord stabs with scale tones. This shift from the tritone back to the root doesn't throw us off too much because we're only lowering our root note by a half step. In the last four measures, our rhythm pattern from the breakdown continues, but we reintroduce notes from our major scale as we are now back in the original key.
There's something in my right. I have a demon inside my right.
Let's take a look at our next song. So this track is riddled with upbeat riffs and good vibes. Just listen to this chorus. But when it comes to the breakdown, a lot of interesting things start to happen. The first two measures in this example have two power chords that are still inside the major scale. Then measure 3 comes in with a power chord built on our scale's root. This is where the trickery happens. I've discussed in a previous video that the magic of power chords is that they aren't actually chords. It is an interval of a perfect fifth, and the perfect fifth is missing any sort of tonal center because of its lack of notes. And the notes it does contain don't give any clues as to whether it's a major or minor, which means this perfect fifth will sound exactly the same, whether you are in a major key or the parallel minor. So when we hear it here, our ears remember it from earlier in a major context, but this is actually a pivot into a new key. It doesn't stop there though. Our new scale we are using is a minor blues scale, which for the sake of simplicity just spices things up. And if it wasn't spicy enough, there is also a chromatic passing tone used here, which again, for simplicity's sake, makes this breakdown hella spicy. Hopefully you've trained your ears with enough wasabi to handle it, but here we go.
Until then, I'll see you in.
Fingers crossed you didn't burn your ears too bad. This song takes a pretty simple approach to get us back into the major key. The chromatic note I mentioned earlier is out of key for the breakdown, but it is in the major scale, and we use that as our point of modulation back into one of the song's main sections. Our last song on the list uses a much more subtle modulation. Earlier we talked about parallel minor being related to major, but there is another relationship we've left out. Every major scale also has a relative minor scale attached. The relative minor uses the exact same notes as its major scale, but it has a different root note. A quick way to figure out your new root is to find the 6th scale degree of your major scale. If we are in C major, our relative scale would be A natural minor. The fact that these scales share all the same notes makes it very easy to go back and forth between them. Sometimes it's hard to even notice, but there is always a shift in the tonal center from major to minor. Our last example today does exactly this. Here you can see the first 4 measures are playing a simple chord progression in a major key. Then when we get to the next 4 measures, there's a tonal shift. On top of that, we get a note that doesn't work in our major scale. This oddball note is actually acting as a raised scale degree in our relative minor scale. We've really only talked about natural minor, but there is also a harmonic minor and a melodic minor. While you're in a minor key, you can weave in and out of these 3 versions to add more color to your music. In this example, we switch to our relative minor, dance around in a harmonic minor for a moment to add some flair, then move back into natural minor. Try to listen for those changes as the song plays. Were you able to hear the tonal center shift around? As far as switching back into the major scale, the next section simply starts on the 3rd scale degree of our natural minor, which happens to be the root in major. A nice and seamless transition. Alright, that's all I've got for today. I hope this inspires some of you to try modulating between major and minor in your own music. Whether you shock your audience with a tritone, use the vagueness of a perfect fifth, shift the tonal center by using the relative minor, or find one of the many ways we didn't discuss to add a level of duality to your music, I'd love to hear what you create. Feel free to send me something you've created by emailing learnmetaltheory@gmail.com. I'd also love to hear suggestions on any video topics if you have any. Until next time, this has been Metal Theory.